Okay. Welcome to the Commission's November 2021 meeting. I want to say how pleased I am that this is a open session, and also that we are here mainly in person. We couldn't all be here in person, but given the circumstances, I'm very, very glad to see everybody. I just want to thank again the people who put this together in terms of the technical aspects and making sure we have the right safety equipment and everything. I think we may be being slightly overcautious, but I'd rather be overcautious than undercautious. So I appreciate all of that. And with that, Madam Secretary, I'll ask you if there's any announcements. I don't believe there are, but okay. And then the Commission is ready for its first item on the agenda.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. You have 4 items on your agenda this morning, 2 in open session and 2 in closed. The first item in open session is a staff briefing on current U.S. macro indicators and their impact on shipping. Kristen Monaco, Director of Bureau of Trade Analysis, will present this item. Kristen.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Maffei and Commissioners. A little closer. The button's on. Let me try this. Close enough. Excellent. Thank you very much. So in this morning's open session, we'll be focused on macroeconomic indicators as well as ocean transportation figures as 2 different items. So I will present the first and Grace the second, and we will pause for questions in between those 2 items. So next slide, please. We're going to start by talking about GDP and its components, acknowledging the fact that transportation is in fact a derived demand. So what happens in transportation is really driven by what's going on with consumer spending, imports, and exports. After talking through some of those major indicators, we'll talk more about prices and whether they're reflecting increased freight rates in our different price indicators, and then spend a little bit of time talking about U.S. labor markets, given the recent attention on whether issues with trucking labor and warehousing and storage worker shortages are leading to exacerbations of supply chain congestion. Next slide. So let's start with measures of personal consumption, and these are from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. These figures on the chart are in real terms, deflated in 2012 dollars. And if you look at the black line, which is total personal consumer spending, you can see it had been increasing in real terms since the 2018 recession. Once the pandemic hits, you see a dip, and we're almost back to the original trajectory it was on pre-pandemic. But if we're just looking at what's going on with total consumer spending, we're overlooking some really interesting underlying trends that have a lot of information about what's going on at the ports, which is spending on services versus spending on goods. So in the slide, you'll see spending on services is your red line. Services drop after the pandemic and have not returned to their pre-pandemic levels in real terms. Goods, however, which are represented by the blue line, dip, and then the growth really takes off after the pandemic, flattening in the last few months. The flattening in consumer goods spending in the last few months is not exactly clear whether that's due to the inflation adjustment masking, so the inflation masking what's going on with the underlying spending, or whether it's actually dropping in nominal terms, and I'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the balance between spending on goods and spending on services. So you can see that even before the pandemic, right, spending on services dominates. Pre-pandemic, spending on services was about 64% of total consumer spending, and goods was about 36%. Right now, that ratio is about 40 to 42% spending on consumer goods and 58 to 60% services. And that 4 to 6 percentage points may not seem like a big deal, but when you're multiplying it by $12 trillion, which is our base total consumer spending, that's a lot of stuff being spent, probably coming here in containers. Okay, next slide. So let's revisit this in nominal terms, right? So we've seen this flattening off in goods spending in real terms. What's going on in nominal terms? And this is really a repeat of the prior chart. It covers a 20-year span. Your services are still in red, so you see that dip and you see what's going on with nominal spending pretty much recovering by this point. And then we take the spending on goods and divide it into two types of goods: durable goods and non-durable goods. So the non-durable goods are the blue line, the light blue line, the durable goods are the dark blue line. And basically your benchmark between whether something's a durable or a non-durable is a durable good is anticipated to last for 3 years or more. So think about furniture and your major household appliances, and non-durables are less than that. So, toilet paper, paper products, some apparel products as well. What you see going on with durable goods is interesting. So it was 2.15 trillion in April, 2.06 trillion in June, and dropping to 1.985 trillion in September. So nominal spending on durable goods has been falling in recent months. Non-durable goods spending, however, continues to increase. 3.43 trillion in April, 3.48 trillion in June, and 3.56 trillion in September. So non-durable goods are still growing in nominal terms. Durables are dropping slightly, so those seem to be canceling each other out when we look at the aggregate goods spending. It's not clear right now whether the decrease in spending on durable goods is due to sort of consumers pulling back their spending, or whether it's due to the fact that a lot of these durable goods are not easily available for purchase. Think about your new cars and certain types of furniture. And so this is sort of a metric we're going to keep our eyes on over the next couple of months. Next slide. Another GDP component is, of course, imports and exports. This is a slightly different number on imports and exports than you might be used to. This is a number out of the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of the Census, and it's a monthly figure on goods only using balance of payments. So this doesn't include imports and exports of services, only goods, and it's on a slightly different accounting method than you would see in, say, the quarterly GDP release. But it allows you to really look at what's going on with the numbers on a monthly basis. This obviously includes all of our trading partners. If you look at the export value in balance of payments, that's the red line. It had been at a high in August, the highest it had been since 2018, and then dropped in value in September. The balance of payment value of imports, however, was 240 billion in September, which is a high for the nominal series. So these last couple of slides have focused on components of GDP in nominal terms, but clearly inflation is on a lot of people's minds these days. What are we seeing there? Next slide, please. This is a true economist chart. I will just take every price index and throw it on the same chart. Basically, these are the 1-month numbers for all of the 4 major measures of inflation that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out. So you have the current price index, the producer price index, the import prices, and the export prices. Looking at those, you can see that the import and export prices tend to bounce around a little bit more. So I'm going to start by focusing on the producer price index. The headline number for the final demand PPI, which came out last week, was up 0.6%. This is slightly higher than the 0.5% we saw in the producer price index in September, but down from the 0.7% in August. The producer price index, however, is up 8.6% year over year, which is equal to what we saw in September and ties the series high. The PPI for final demand series began in 2010, so this is a series high versus 2010 levels. Transportation and warehousing of goods for final demand in the producer price index was up 13.8% year over year and 2.1% in the last month. This has been ticking upwards consistently over the last 3 months, and that's where we would expect to see sort of inflation leading from higher freight rates pushing through into other indicators. So that's the producer price index. The consumer price index was released last Wednesday. It got a lot of attention. The headline number was 6.2% year over year, which is the highest it's been since November 1990. The 9-month increase was 0.9%, which was higher, markedly higher from the 0.4% in September, but I will point out it was also 0.9% in June. If we dive into sort of the sub-indexes in the CPI and the PPI looking at specific goods, we see furniture and sporting goods have had increases in prices over the last year, and apparel is relatively flat. So if we're looking at the goods that tend to be imported, we're seeing increases in prices somewhat substantial in furniture and sporting goods, but sort of flat in apparel continuing till today. This morning at 8:30, the BLS released their international prices. Import price headline number up 1.2% in October. This is the highest it's been since it was 1.3% in May. It's 10.7% year over year. Most of that is driven by fuel prices, imports of fuel, not from other goods. The non-fuel import price index was up 0.4% in October, 5.5% year over year. The October number is higher. In September, it was 0.1. It was flat in July and August. So it is ticking up, but not as high as the headline number would indicate once you take out the fuel prices. Export prices were up 1.5% in October. This is the highest since the 2.3% in May, up 18% year over year. Ag export prices were up 1% in October. They bounce around a lot. They were down 1.5% in September, but export price index is up 24.5% year over year for agricultural and up 17.2% year over year for non-ag. The non-ag number for export prices in October was 1.5%. Looking at trading partners and our indexes with major trading partners, import prices, the import price index for goods from China was up 0.2% last month, 4.2% year over year, which is relatively high for this series, but not sort of unprecedented, just unusual, and we will continue to track. Export prices, exports to Canada were up 1.4% last month, 15.1% year over year. Exports to Mexico, index up 2.1% last month, 28% year over year. Next slide, please. So turning from prices to labor markets, right? I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the labor markets, because I think most of the stories you see about what's going on with supply chain also at some point in the article mentions what's going on with the labor force, right? Do we have the workers to handle the goods once they get to this country? So we're going to start with the labor force statistics. These come from the two components of the employment situation. The employment situation is released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, generally the first Friday of the month, from two different surveys. There's a household survey, which is used to generate things like the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate that you see on these slides. The sample size there is about 60,000 households. The establishment survey is a sample of about 144,000 establishments. So when we're looking at something like the unemployment rate or the labor force participation rate, it's helpful when we're presenting things in percentages to think about what the levels are associated with these measures. The total civilian non-institutional population is sort of the denominator on which all these percentages are based. 261 million last month. Of those 261 million people in the U.S. civilian non-institutionalized population, 161 million were in the labor force, 150 million employed, and 11 million unemployed. Right? And so the point here is when you're looking at the labor force has two main subcomponents: those who are employed, those who are unemployed. Not in the labor force means you are neither employed nor are you looking for employment. So when we're looking at the unemployment rate, which is the red line, which is measured off of the right axis, the unemployment rate was 4.6% in October, down from 4.8% in September. So it's trending downward over time. It's still above its pre-pandemic level of 3.5%. The labor force participation rate is obviously still getting a good deal of attention. That is measured with the blue line off of the left axis. And I know the axis is a little misleading because it's only scaled from 58 to 64, so this might look a little more dramatic than it is. But when we're looking at this, understand that labor force participation rate was at about 63% before the pandemic, dropped down to a little over 60% after the pandemic, and has sort of settled back at around 61.5%. So It doesn't seem to be returning to its pre-pandemic level, and you get a lot of press coverage on that. Does it matter a lot if the labor force participation rate has dropped about 1.5 to 2 percentage points? Again, if our base level that we're calculating it on is a civilian non-institutional population of 261 million people, 1.5 to 2 percentage points represents a lot of people. On the establishment side of the employment situation, the headline number last month for October was an increase in employment of 531 jobs, and higher for the private sector, around 600,000 jobs. These numbers do get revised because this is off a smaller sample, and so they do get adjusted from month to month. Next slide, please. Focusing on sort of the numbers for the industries that are of concern when thinking about the supply chain. Here we have the establishment employment numbers for transportation, truck transportation, and warehousing and storage industries off compared to the private sector. So you see for the private sector, which is the black line measured off the right axis, you get a drop in private sector employment post-pandemic, and it's been growing since, but has not returned to its pre-pandemic levels. Before I talk specifically about truck transportation, I do want to reiterate that the source of this information is an establishment survey, and it's an industry classification. And the reason I go to great pains to mention this is because sometimes you look at the series for truck transportation and people think that means truck drivers. It doesn't. Truck driver is an occupation. Truck transportation is an industry. It includes people who aren't truck drivers. It also only includes employees. So if you're looking for information on, say, independent contractor, owner-operators, you're not seeing them in these numbers. It's also the case that the establishment is classified by its primary line of business at that location. So if you are a truck driver who reports to, say, a grocery store, you are in private carriage and you wouldn't necessarily show up in these numbers. So it's a proxy for what's going on in employment in the trucking industry, but it's not specifically meant to measure truck drivers. It's to give you an overall picture. With all of those caveats aside, you can see that truck transportation employment dropped in the pandemic and has recovered somewhat, but still has a way to go before it hits its pre-pandemic level. Truck transportation did add 8,000 jobs in October. Warehousing and storage, however, which is the red line, dipped after the pandemic, but in fact has grown to far exceed its pre-pandemic levels of employment. So you hear a lot of information about potential shortages among warehousing workers. I think it's important to note that there are more warehousing and storage workers in terms of employment than there have been in the past. Okay, so the series is at a high, the series continues to grow. I'm not going to sort of address the shortage, but just to put it in perspective, this is an industry that has been adding jobs throughout the pandemic and exceeds its pre-pandemic level. Next slide. So what's going on with average hourly earnings in these industry sectors? Because this is part of understanding what's going on in a labor force. Are you able to attract labor depends a lot upon what people can expect to be paid. Again, this is from the employment situation report. This is this establishment survey that comes out monthly. And the measure here is average hourly earnings. And there's lots of great, interesting detail here. I will just point out that an average is not always the best way to understand a labor market, but it is what we have for an indicator. And the reason I'm saying that right now is if you look at this chart, what you'll see is right after the pandemic, it looks like average hourly earnings are going up, which they are. And that's not because workers were better off. It's because the people who lost work first were at the lower end of the distribution, right? So there's two reasons an average can go up. An average can go up because, right, the rising tide, everyone's doing better. In this case, you see that blip with the average going up because the lower end of the distribution was without work. And so that made the resulting average increase. But I think with that aside, you can see that average hourly earnings have not been going up substantially in nominal terms for private sector and definitely not for warehousing and storage or truck transportation. If you couple a nominal increase of about $1 or $2 with what we've already seen happening with the CPI, in real terms, these are not jobs that are paying substantially more money over time. Next slide. Another way to understand job markets or think about job markets is the Employment Cost Index. This is a different measure of what's going on with wages and salaries. It comes out quarterly, and it's based upon the cost of employment. You can think of this as sort of a measure of wage inflation. So if the CPI is the measure of the cost of a basket of goods and services, the Employment Cost Index would be the hypothetical cost of a basket of jobs, if you think of it that way. It is a good way to track trends in wages and salaries because it does focus on a fixed basket of jobs over time, so you get less strange aberrations than you do in, say, the average hourly earnings that can happen. What you can see in the Employment Cost Index for all private industry is that after an initial dip post-pandemic, wages and salaries for private industry workers have generally been rising on the order of 1% per quarter. The last quarter, which ended September, the increase in wages and salaries for private industry was 1.6%, which is unusually high for this series. Generally speaking, over the 40-some-odd year history of the Employment Cost Index, wages and salaries go up on the order of 0.6 to 0.7% per quarter, so 1.6% is high. Transportation and warehousing, however, has been below the private sector level, so they tend to be lagging. The annual number for wages and salaries is 4.2% for transportation and warehousing industry versus 4.6% increase for all private industry. If we look at a broader measure than wages and salaries, there's a measure of total compensation costs, which includes benefits like health, retirement, leave, non-production bonus. And looking at that metric, the total compensation index is up 3.2% for transportation and warehousing over the last year, but 4.1% for all private industry. So jobs in these sectors are lagging in terms of total compensation costs, both in wages and salaries and in benefits. So that brings us to the end of agenda item 1, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Monaco. I'll just say that was a very, very good and thorough presentation, which will probably be awarded with a lot of questions. Commissioner Dye.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's great, a great briefing. I really appreciate it. I'm interested if you know how e-commerce has boosted not only volumes, but freight rates of imports into the United States.
So I would, in terms of the price indices or in terms of general freight rates? In terms of the price indices, there's some experimental indexes on that. I can look at them and get back to you on that. I have not been tracking them that actively, no.
And now that you mentioned freight rates, anything about that generally?
The impact of e-commerce on freight rates? I am going to defer that to our rate conversation for slightly later in the morning, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
That's great. And I have another freight rate question, so I'll save that one as well. Thank you very much.
You all set, Rebecca?
Yes, thank you.
Commissioner Corey couldn't be with us in person today, but hopefully he's still there by phone. Commissioner Corey, it's you.
Yes.
Go ahead and ask questions. I yield to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Monaco, for a great presentation here. My question, if you could go back on page 7, where you're talking about labor force statistics. And do you have a total number actual number, not rates, on how many people are sitting on the sidelines. I forget, they're not participating, but they would be available to come back into the workforce versus those that are in the workforce, the actual numbers.
Yes, sir. So thanks, Commissioner Corey, for that question. In the most recent statistics, there were about 500,000 discouraged workers, which I think is the category closest to what you're describing. And I will add, in addition to that, there's many other metrics of people who aren't quite able to be in the labor force the way they want to. So there were 6.7 million part-time workers for economic reasons. This is sometimes business conditions, or they could only find part-time work. So that would also possibly fall into the category you're asking about.
Okay, are the part-time included or not included in the employment number?
They are included in the employment number, but I think it's also important to note that if their desired status would be full-time in the labor force versus part-time in the labor force, but they are in the labor force, yes. About 500,000 were listed as discouraged workers, those who were not in the labor force because they had essentially given up looking for work.
Okay, so 6.7 million part-time, that's included in the labor. And the reason I'm just pausing on this, a statistic I saw recently as to port congestion and the shortage of truck drivers, and it was pointed out as to the number of truck drivers who have licenses in California but are not currently working as truck drivers. And it was a pretty big number, and it just the suggestion was if wage rates would go up, there's actually a lot of people out there with a commercial driver's license that could come into the workforce. And that's why I was interested in that number.
Certainly, and I would say you're absolutely right. The unemployment, so we don't have an unemployment rate for people who are previously just truck drivers, but if we expand it to transportation and warehousing, that employment rate is about 5.6%. But yes, it's also worth knowing that there are a good number of people who hold commercial driver's licenses who do not work currently in truck driving jobs.
Okay, thank you very much. A great presentation, Doctor. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Corey. Commissioner Sola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I can't say how happy I am to see everybody here today after a year and a half, and how we pushed technology to the limits. And let me say, it's a lot nicer to be here and be in person. And thank you, Dr. Monaco. That was a very good overview of the current situation. My question would be specifically to page 5, the balance of payments of goods, which I believe is a common term, as we call trade imbalance, that can be. And I see pre-pandemic, we had about the same amount of imports and exports. And right now, there's a major trade imbalance that I think goes back, according to this chart, to the economic crisis that we had in 2008. Can you address some of that or give me some general comments on why we have such a large trade imbalance right now? Or do you see that widening or leveling off?
So yeah, that's a very good question. And I will point out that I can also provide some statistics after this briefing on the more traditional measures of imports and exports. But yes, as noted, and this is why we were tracking and especially trying to track the monthly numbers on this balance of payments approach, is that there was clearly a huge increase in imports due to consumer spending. But what's been more interesting to us and what we've been tracking is sort of that trailing off in exports in recent months. So it had hit a high and now it seems to be turning a corner, and it had resumed to its 2018 levels. I think that has a lot to do with port congestion. We've seen in major ports the number of exports drop off remarkably in the last couple of months, and that contributes to this imbalance, right? This is a value-based in all trading partners, but it does, if you sort of slice at it enough, what we're seeing at the ports in terms of congestion and the consumer demand pulling in so many more imports, and then the congestion sort of making exports drop off, you see that in this widening deficit in the last couple of months in this balance of payments approach.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question, do you see this trend continuing, or is the gap narrowing?
So I'm not the best forecaster, but I would say given what we know now about the dynamics, in order for it to narrow again, you'd undoubtedly you undoubtedly would see a decrease or a dampening in some of the consumer spending on goods, right? And an increase in the number of exports. And we're not seeing that in recent months. I would say also a big part of our total balance of payments is, of course, services, and this isn't included here. So in just the goods measure, because there's so much consumer demand driven by goods, that pulls the imports into the country, and the exports do seem to be stifled in recent months due to congestion or other factors, but probably mostly congestion.
Thank you very much. No more questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Sola. Commissioner Bensel.
Thanks, Kristen. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it. It was gave a good macro overview, so I appreciate that. I have two questions for you. The issue on the trucking, when we were going through, I think it's pages 8 and 9. Trucking is integral to every ocean shipping movement. Of course, it's going to be handled at least one time, probably multiple times. So availability of trucking resources is a critical issue. And so you were going through what your statistics were based on here. And when we got to the end, I felt like there's not much left in terms of a true statistical analysis. And I represented at a previous point in my career, the owner-operator Independent Truck Drivers Association. At the time, I think they transported about 75% of the intercity transportation and trucking. And so our trucking industry has gone from, in the maritime world, we would say, they've gone from ocean carriers to non-vessel owning common carriers. They are no longer in the business really of effectively providing their own resources for trucking. So I think we need to get a better system of quantifying what's out there. And so my question is there better statistics that we can get in this area? Because there's so much limitation with the data that we're looking at now. So is there a better source to try to quantify what's really going on in this market?
Well, that's just you teeing up a question I like to answer, and in fact have tried to answer in the last week for the Department of Transportation. I've studied trucking for about 26 years now, and it's always sort of been the same. It is frustratingly difficult to get a picture of the entire industry. If someone asked me how many owner-operator independent drivers there were, I could not give them an accurate number, and I think OIDA cannot either, right? We have estimates based upon truck registries, based upon looking at people who report being self-employed in the census or BLS surveys, based upon tax return data from the IRS on the self-employed. We don't have even a single statistic on how many owner-operators there are. Similarly, it's really difficult to reconcile private carriage drivers, right? Where do we find them in their places of employment? How are they being collected in official surveys? And so generally speaking, I think most people who are looking at these questions use some combination of official government statistics, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their industry stats, their occupation stats, census, and then we go to the administrative records to try to calibrate the IRS, census, and even the Motor Carrier Management Information System that FMCSA has, gives you some information about how many trucks that carriers are leasing, and that becomes a proxy for owner-operators. It's very difficult. And then, as you know, when trying to drill down to port drayage, there is no industry or occupational classification that gets at that, and we know so many of those drivers, particularly on the West Coast, are classified as independent contractors. So it's a quandary, and I'm happy to brainstorm it, but it's some combination right now of government statistics and administrative records, but there's not one perfect number people can point to.
Okay. Well, I do think this is a critical issue as we move forward, just because it's such a necessary component in movement of cargo. The second question I had, your statistics on the levels of consumption in the United States, they tail off recently. However, we have a lot of vessels that are not delivering cargo. 70 ships in LA Long Beach, and we have, Commissioner Sola and I were just in Seattle, Tacoma, and there was a number of vessels waiting in the Puget Sound to get service. Savannah is the same. And so does the statistics that we saw today reflect these delays in the movement of, I've heard, upwards of 100,000 TEUs is sitting offshore. So is the temporary dip a result of congestion, or is it a result of consumption reductions?
That is a question. I think that's sort of one of the points I hit at the end and why we'll continue to track this series. My hunch is that it's congestion oriented because non-durable spending is still going up so much, and we will track. It'll be interesting over the next few months to sort of track that statistic against the congestion levels and see if we can try to get at a benchmark to see how much higher it would be absent congestion.
Mr. Chairman, I'm fine.
Great, thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Monaco, for your excellent analysis. One quick question: is there some way to take the inflation numbers on overall goods and subtract overall imported goods and subtract Mexico and Canada to get some sort of approximation of what has to come in overseas? Obviously, not all overseas is shipped on ships, but most of it is. So is there some way to do that?
Yes, they have a number of series. I can try to pull out a few that get a little bit closer to what you're asking for, and we can send those to you.
I think it would be useful. I mean, obviously, it's limited, and we have to know the limits of that. Air freight would be in that too, of course, but I think that would be useful, so I would appreciate if you would do that. In terms of the overall consumption expenditures going up, is that in some way analogous with aggregate demand for goods? Can we just draw 1-to-1 on that, or how would that work?
Yes, as long as, so I would say, and that sort of hits Commissioner Bensel's question as well, as long as there's supply to meet that demand, right? So you can think of spending as some intersection of aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the consumer market. So in times where people don't have trouble getting access to some of the goods that they would like to get access to, those could be seen as analogous or sort of a one-to-one mapping.
Do we
Now
have any measures of overall demand for goods? This is basically as close as we can get, or?
That's as close as we can get. So the consumer spending sort of tells you what they've actually done. I would say from an economics perspective, your aggregate demand is reflected in what you actually go out and do.
Yep.
Again, barring not having access to something, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, well, this is a pretty speculative question. I'll certainly understand if you can't answer it. But given that it seems that the aggregate demand for goods anyway, or the personal consumption of goods continues to increase, and that we've had at least, certainly not unprecedented, but unusual levels of inflation in the sector. Does it surprise you that the inflation is not reducing demand more? How come the inflation, in other words, when inflation goes up, the price goes up, you would think demand would go down, according to my basic Harvard economics class. Is that happening here, or is it not happening, or is it just simply too soon to tell?
So we don't see it yet. We see it a little bit in that nominal dip just in recent months. So to your point, right, if inflation is dampening, we should see that in the nominal spending. So that's not adjusted. And we see that nominal spending on durable goods dropping in recent months, and it's not clear whether it's due to congestion and inability to go out and spend that money, or because consumers are starting to pull back because things are more expensive, not necessarily the durable goods themselves. It could be that the non-durables are more expensive and taking a higher portion of their paycheck to pay for, so they don't have money left over. I think we'll need to see how this plays out over the next few months, especially through the holiday season.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, and I know we can't draw much of a conclusion now, but I would appreciate if you keep an eye on that, because obviously if we can start drawing conclusions, that might be helpful in figuring out what to do. I do want to get to what Commissioner Corey was talking about a bit with the overall, with the truckers and the warehouse workers, and I found this part particularly interesting. And I'll just say a statement that is not completely in my area of expertise or in the jurisdiction of this commission, but that I guess is a working theory of mine, that a good portion of the issue here is not actually in our ports. The congestion may appear to be in our ports, but it's like a clogged sink where the muddy water is building up in the sink, but there's actually nothing wrong with the fixture of the sink itself. It's with the pipes below. And it seems to me that a lot of the issue is lack of warehousing, lack of truckers. Obviously, there's equipment issues, so it's all very complex. But I did find it interesting that we don't really see any increase in transportation and warehousing hourly earnings. We see some small increase nominally, but as you mentioned, in real terms, there's pretty much no additional increase. We do see more employment there, which is a good thing, but I suspect compared to the demand, there's not enough. Do you expect these wages, the hourly earnings, to start creeping up for transportation and warehouse industries? I just don't see how we can get sufficient workers in those sectors unless wages creep up a bit. And any other comment you have on what I just said?
Thank you, sir. So you would expect that if there were a shortage, wages would rise to clear out the shortage. It does get a little more complex in trucking because of those segments, again, as Commissioner Bensel referenced. So these series, again, are surveys based upon establishments who employ people. So owner-operators, specifically port drayage, just aren't in these numbers at all. And there are not good numbers on earnings of port drayage drivers. But to go back to your sort of clogged sink in the pipes analogy, it's absolutely the case that for truck drivers, we have a really unusual occupation. Their hours of service dictate their hours, whereas many people think about a 40-hour work week. That's not the norm for them. There are complex rules that govern their hours of service. They're subject to fair labor standards in an interesting way and not a standard way. And this is a large occupation in which certain segments of the occupation are expected to spend great deals of their time waiting, not getting paid, but while still working. And that becomes problematic when that waiting time goes up above a threshold, right? And so if you anticipate that, say, between 20 and 33% of a long haul or a drayage driver's time is spent waiting to get in and out of a loading dock, to pick things up, to get in the port gates, and that waiting time ratio goes up to 50%. It's not that you don't have enough people, it's that you've effectively taken away your capacity of the people, right? Yeah. So think of it as sort of reducing your labor supply, but having the same number of people there because you're just not making use of their time. And that is an inefficiency, and it's not currently paid, which means there's very little economic incentive to fix that inefficiency.
Understood. Is it at all simpler with the warehouse workers? I have anecdotally, when I was out in LA Long Beach, there was a lot of talk about, well, you could open the gates, 24/7 or what have you. You could even find the truckers sometimes, particularly if they could find a chassis. That was a bigger deal, I guess, than the truckers. But if you could find a trucker and a chassis, but there was, at least other than the really big BCOs, the warehouses simply weren't open then. And so what, where are they going to bring it? Is there any indication, anything more on warehouse workers? Is that at all clearer?
I mean, I think we see that warehouse employment is going up, but their wages are not going up. And right now, there's a lot of people competing for the workers that are basically paid at the lower end of the distribution. And so the logical conclusion would be if you need to fill those jobs, there should be an upward pressure on wages to do this. Again, noting that warehousing and trucking are the portions of the supply chain that generally have the lowest margins over time. So the ability to sort of individually get the wages bid up, this is sort of something that's going to take a lot more time and happen in the aggregate.
Yeah, I understand, and, you know, given our jurisdiction, there's probably not too much we can do about it other than point out the issues. But I do find it interesting that those areas seem to be more sticky. Those wages seem to be more sticky on the low side than one might expect, and I certainly think people looking at the overall supply chain issues should take a look at that. Again, I actually have some more questions, but I think that I need to hear the second part before we get to those questions. Madam Secretary, do you want to introduce Dr. Wang? Or
Yes.
did you already introduce Dr. Wang, or?
I'll do it now, sir, for the
Okay.
good of the record. The second item on your agenda is a briefing on the state of the U.S. international ocean trades, capacity, and pricing. This item will be presented by Grace Wang of the Bureau of Trade Analysis.
Before letting you continue, Dr. Wang, I would like to congratulate you on your new position of Director of Competition Analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Furthermore, I'd like to offer you my condolences on your promotion to the new position of Director of Competition Analysis. You may proceed with your presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, commissioners, and fellow FNC colleagues. Very nice to see you. And I'm going to continue to talk with the U.S. trade and countermeasures import and exports. This presentation is intended to provide an overview of the current trade conditions focusing on the liner shipping industry. We will share information on alliance market shares, U.S. countermeasures import and export, and the change of a top commodity on a year-over-year basis. Looking at the Trans-Pacific slide, collectively, the three global alliances have market share of 91% in the Trans-Pacific trade in the first half of 2021, according to peers. Ocean Alliance is the largest carrier alliance in the Trans-Pacific, moving 43% of the cargo in the time period. They are followed by Lee Alliance with 25% and 2M Alliance with 23%. Compared to the first half of 2020, 2M has increased its market share from 19% to 23% due to the reestablishment of a service suspended in the early 2020. In comparison, Lee Alliance market share dropped from 31% to 25% in the first half of 2021. Ocean Alliance shares remain relatively stable compared to the previous year when it was 44%. Next, please. Moving into the transatlantic market shares, very similar situation can be observed. 89% of the transatlantic trade is services by Alliance and its carrier, with 2M leading the market of 42%. Compared to the first half of 2020, 2M has increased market share in this trade from 38% to 42%. And meanwhile, market shares for Ocean Alliance has dropped 2% from 20 to 18%, and Lee Alliance dropped 3% from 32 to 29. And of note, Ocean Alliance stopped servicing the Mediterranean trade in February of 2021, so their market share in this trade will decline. Next, please. Now take a look about the U.S. containerized import and export. This table presents U.S. containerized imports and exports through the sub-coast. From the volume perspective, the trade are imbalanced, with more imports entering into the U.S. from Asia than U.S. export load bound for Asia. A similar imbalances exist in the transatlantic trade, with more imports serving the U.S. Atlantic and Gulf ports than U.S. exports to Europe. The inbound market moves more volumes, usually with higher rates. Compared to the first half of 2020, container imports in the first half of 2021 through the region reported was up 30%, while export was slightly down by 1%. Import growth has been consistent and significant across all U.S. coasts. and export volume has declined at all U.S. coasts except the U.S. East Coast. In terms of value, U.S. container export was valued around $191 billion year-to-date through August of 2021. That represents a 13% increase compared to 2021's and the same level as in the 2019. U.S. containerized import totaled $611 billion year-to-date through August, indicated 27% increase from 2020 and a 13% increase from the 2019's level. Next, please. And now we're taking a closer look of a U.S. West Coast container import and export, starting with import. So you can see 4 lines included in the chart. Lighter lines represent the imports of 2020, and the darker number shows the volume in 2021. And the first 2 bluish lines are the volume through the Trans-Pacific Southwest trade, and the red ones are represents through the PNW, Pacific Northwest trade. And overall, import volumes were greater in 2021 compared to those during the pandemic in 2020. So the darker lines is always above the lighter one. And in July, import grew 21% for the PNW and 8% for the PSW. And the number, however, in August has were lower compared to July's number. And looking at containerized export, compared to the import side, which considerably increased over the first 7 months of 2021, export were below 2020's level for both PNW and PSW. So you can see the darker lines are most of the time below the lighter lines. It appears that the export volume grew in February and March, and uptick in export utilization reflect the marginal contributions of the backhaul exports. And in July, export volume dropped 70% year over year for the PSW and 12% for the PNW. So you can see the gap of those 2 lines gotten wider in July number. And in August, both numbers, export through the PSW and PSW are slightly rebound. And in September, since Pierce data is currently not available, so we look into the port's website. For the Port of Los Angeles, the export number still indicated continuous decline coast-wise. And for the Port of Long Beach, however, the numbers are more stable. The loaded export ranging from 110,000 to 112,000 from July to October. And the following slides actually just take a look about the July data to see whether we can have an interpretation about the difference between this year's number versus 2020's number. Looking into July's data, this table presents a year-over-year comparison for the top export commodity through the PSW in TEUs. Using July as a benchmark, last column shows the year-over-year changes compared to the situation pre-pandemic in 2019. Compare July 19 to 2021, 4 out of 10 top export has reached the pre-pandemic level. Those are waste papers, food residuals, meat, and fruit and nuts. One agriculture commodities consistently grew over the time period, which is edible fruit and nuts. However, the volumes for 2 agriculture commodities, oil seeds and miscellaneous grain and cotton, have continuous decline, and with significant drop of volume in cotton in July. And other top commodities that have experienced similar drops were plastic and iron steel. So from these slides, we kind of give you an idea about the commodity change and what's happening in the year-over-year comparison. And that concludes my presentation. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Also a very good presentation. I'll recognize Commissioner Dye.
As I look at these commodity quantifications, do you have any insight into what's causing some of these increases or declines? For example, cotton down 38%.
Thank you, Commissioner Dai, for the question. I think this morning I also looked into the month-over-month comparison, and we do see a huge fluctuations among those agriculture commodity in a month-over-month basis. So if we look at in 2019's number, we can see that usually in the spring seasons, like the volume is consistent.
Right,
And then
right.
in summers, usually it's like from March to July-ish, the number is high. And then this year, especially in 2021, it's just a significant drop in that particular month. So I think if we are comparing the coming August and September data, we probably have a more consistent way to see whether it's seasonality or not.
Right. And of course, we hear concerns from our exporters that they are unable to obtain space, and there are other obstacles to getting on a ship at the right time for the right delivery. So I'd be interested in talking to you some more about these numbers. Thank you. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Dye. Commissioner Corey?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first off, good presentation. Second, I would likewise interested in Commissioner Dye's line of questioning is having some drill down on these various subgroups that have large declines as to how much can we get some reasons behind that. My question goes back to page 12, just to, if I caught your presentation correctly, did I understand you to say that the Ocean Alliance, I'm on page 12 now, the Ocean Alliance stopped serving the Mediterranean, is that correct?
That's correct.
And does that, MSC has always had a large presence in the Med. Does that indicate why MSC is now 30% of transatlantic because their participation on the Mediterranean side has gone up?
Commissioner Corey, I will probably check and get back to you on that to see exactly the percentage change of the MSC over the period. But we do notice that the percentage with MSC and Maersk combined did increase this year in the first half year comparison. So we do believe there's some substitutions between Ocean and 2M. But then to be exact about the percentage between MSC and Maersk, I will probably need to get back to you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Corey. Commissioner Sola?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Wong. My line of questioning, I guess, would go along with, as we talked earlier, or my question was earlier, about the trade imbalances. And according to slide 13, we're seeing that overall imports are up roughly 30%, with the Pacific Northwest and the Pacific Southwest leading the way. At the same time, we see that the East Coast and the Gulf Coast are holding steady or slightly increasing their the exports, whereas the Pacific Northwest and Southwest are taking a pretty big hit. And as we go to page 16, I believe that every single item on there, besides vehicle parts and accessories, which we understand there's some supply chain issues on exports, they all seem to be agricultural, or I would sum that up as a low-cost exports, or exports without a lot of value, or according to electronics or some other things. My question would go is to the availability. Are they being able to get the availability? And I think that is something that both Commissioner Dye and Commissioner Corey brought up, and something that I would also like to drill down into to see if that is an issue. And if you have any general comments on it, I would love to hear them.
Thank you, Commissioner Sola, for your question. And I think you're exactly right in observations in terms of tables, like imbalances for the West Coast compared to the East and Gulf Coast numbers. And we do, slide number 16, the commodity breakdown actually is focused on PSW trade. So the dynamic may be slightly different if we're looking at other different U.S. coasts, because Gulf Coast do have different commodity combinations compared to the West Coast and East Coast. And sometimes the substitution between coasts, it will be an interesting dynamic as well. Also depends on the freight rates, because we are going to cover some rate increases for PSW, for TP inbound and TP outbound trade. So I think in terms of a change of commodities, availability also based on rates as well.
That brings up a very interesting point. Are you seeing a diversion of some of the exports from the Pacific to the Gulf Coast, or maybe now to the East Coast?
We do see some substitutions, but in terms of commodity breakdown, we probably need to look more closely into that. But we do see the increase of volume of total import switching a little bit, like an increase in the Gulf Coast volume.
Thank you very much. No more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Sola. Commissioner Bensel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions. The statistics on page 14, again, I wanted to make sure that these are landed containers in terms of imports and do not reflect those volumes that are out at sea. And just, I'm hearing totals of 200,000 TEUs are out at sea and not been landed, but do our statistics include anything that was not at port?
This is load. I think the number is from here for the loaded import
Okay.
exports. Yes.
Okay. So it really probably is higher statistics in terms of the volume of imports if we look at which has gotten into the United States territorial sea at least and not been unloaded, excuse me. I wanted to, it's really sort of stunning numbers, and I'll talk more in the next session about the discrepancy between exports and imports and the volumes. But I wanted to, statistics are usually reflective of many factors. And so we have some statistics from the first 6 months of 2020, and those reflect the first 3 months of the pandemic, and then a cargo surge, actually, so it's probably a pretty balanced period of time. But I would appreciate getting the same statistics from 2019, because I just want to make sure those statistics are not skewed because of the pandemic. And other than that, I think we really need to look, at the continuation of the export reductions compared to the import increases that are truly sort of stunning when you look at them, 20 to 30%. There's not many markets out there that have increases of 20 to 30%. But anyways, I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Bensel. My first question is just in terms of the market shares, and it seems that from year to year, the declines and increases have been rather dramatic comparatively. Is that true? I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but has this been more like, for instance, the alliance going from 31 to 25%, 6 percentage points in a single year seems like a lot. Is that the case, or do they fluctuate like this, a good portion of the time?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your question. I think this year is considered like a normal case. Like we believe usually the percentage change is like within 1 or 2%. But then for Lee Alliance this year, for especially Trans-Pacific market share and also transatlantic, they have a huge percentage change due to, I think mainly due to the congestion, because Lee Alliance is very active in practicing blank sailings. So they do have a lot of number of blank sailings also with capacities being affected by congestion. And I think that will contribute one of the reasons why they have a significant percentage change in particular trade.
All right, so certainly the movement isn't due to customers making decisions and saying, well, this carrier is better than that carrier, but it's due to other circumstances, and particularly to the extent that it's unusual, it's due to the congestion, you think?
Right.
All right, thank you, that's very helpful. I think a lot of people have focused on the exports and imports. This has a lot of, this is pretty concerning data, because at least if you look at page 13, those huge numbers of increased imports compared with either very modest positives on the East Coast and Pacific Southwest, or relatively modest positives, and then negative change, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that imports are crowding out exports to some extent. And some of the stuff that we've talked about in this meeting in terms of the congestion seems to be affecting exports more than imports. I'm not sure if you can comment, but do you have any comment on that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, based on the numbers we have, like a half-year comparison, we do see that the export for the U.S., particularly West Coast side, has dropped significantly. And then in the meantime, we do see the increase of volume in imports, and also the rate disparity between head haul and back haul contributes significantly to their decision, because I think that's a commercial decision. So we do have some concern about the turnaround times and then availability of containers for exporters. And but again, in terms of commodity breakdown, the number is different in the month-over-month basis. So if we want to look into more detail about trends, what type of commodity being affected, then we also need to consider the commodity price and then the weight of the commodity. So it's more than one factor is being included in the consideration about whether the container will be available or not.
So are you sort of saying that the overall value of exports may in fact not be down, but may be up? It's just the volume of containers is well, at least lower in these particular ports. Is that possible? Or do we have higher value exports crowding out lower value exports?
I think for that particular one, we may have some information from the service contract, but not to the commodity detail. And then the one I just said in terms of like a higher value, lower value is the general observations in terms of a commodity type. So it's not for a particular type of commodities.
Right. Okay. So I can't just conclude, I can't look at oil seeds, miscellaneous grains, seeds and fruits being down, but edible fruits and nuts and melons being up to some extent, and food industry residues being up as any kind. That's just it's a correlation. It's not necessarily causal.
Mr. Chairman, just based on what you said, I think you refer to like reefer containers have some preference being given other than other type of commodities, because reefers does have reflect a higher rates.
Okay. It is, I guess it's a little bit difficult to sort of figure out how we've got such a buildup of empty containers, and yet at the same time, we're seeing, if anything, fewer containers of exports going, and yet everyone's testifying that the ships are full. So I'm trying to figure out, I don't think there's anything in your presentation that could shed light on that. I'll leave it open to you or Dr. Monaco, if you could, to sort of figure out what is the dynamic here in terms of the exports. Are they are as many boxes of exports going on these ships, and it's just the commodities are different, or is there any way to sort of look at all these numbers in total and sort of figure out what's going on overall with exports? Totally. Either in terms of TEUs or in terms of value. I see nodding, so I'm gonna assume that that's no answer now, but we'll try to get me some answer. Okay. All right. Look, obviously, this is of huge concern, and I'll just as a quick statement, I do think that this is something that my former colleagues in Congress and certainly the administration need to turn to. I will note, though, that the administration, whether you like their approach or not, the port envoy has been focusing on congestion, and it does seem, I can't say there's any huge conclusions, but it does seem that congestion is a huge problem for exporters, an even bigger problem for exporters than importers. So I do applaud the administration, at least for their focus on congestion being an issue. But I think that this goes well beyond that. It's not like before the pandemic, we didn't have complaints about exports having a harder time than imports logistically, movement of dates in which you had to get the export cargo to, but all of that has gotten far worse during the pandemic and the aftermath of it. So obviously this is an area where we need to look as closely. I know Commissioner Dye's done a lot of work here and will continue to do so, but also outside of our current jurisdiction, we need to make sure that people turn to this. So I'll just say that. I'll thank you again, Dr. Wang and Dr. Monaco. Before we turn to the closed portion of the meeting today, I want to briefly recognize Commissioner Dye for a brief announcement. Commissioner Dye.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Starting December 1st, I'm convening 6 FMC innovation teams to conclude discussions we've had during fact-finding 29 on 2 important port processes: container return and earliest return date. The goal is to increase reliability and coherence in these 2 areas in our major port gateways, Los Angeles, Long Beach, and New York, New Jersey. The goal for container return is double moves for truckers. Return a container to the terminal from which it was released and pick up another load. This would improve trucker productivity and remove a constant source of conflict over a container return. It would also resolve problems with appointment systems and chassis shortages. Earliest return date confusion is a terrible problem for our exporters. Once again, we need certainty and predictability in this port process. This reform would also remove the constant problem of demurrage and detention charges to exporters that are not in compliance with our interpretative rule. Our teams will include executives from alliance carriers, including the chief executive officers in the United States, meeting with executives from marine terminals on which they call in LA, Long Beach, and New York, New Jersey. We choose particular places in the supply chain for teams engagement that we believe warrant intense, focused consideration. For example, we were motivated to address demurrage and detention to increase Commission resources devoted to enforcement of demurrage and detention, in part to remove the need for shippers to negotiate additional free time at marine terminals, an aggravation of marine terminal business practices. We've had valuable discussions virtually on these topics, but now that we can meet face-to-face, we can finalize details in these important areas and make significant change. I want to thank all the team importers and exporters and truckers, longshore labor, marine terminal and ocean carrier representatives, and others who have met with us on these issues and others that we hope may resolve in our meetings as part of Fact Finding 29. I also want to thank Alliance executives and Marine Terminal executives who want to be part of the change that we need to increase freight delivery productivity in the United States. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely, Commissioner Dye, I want to thank you for that work. It certainly has my approval, though I would note you don't need my approval because you already have it under the Fact-Finding 29 mandate. But I do believe that the only way we're going to find long-term solutions to these problems is to convene all of the stakeholders, and you become very expert at doing this, and to try to find solutions that do work for everybody. And it just does follow very well onto our previous discussion. I think where all of us were concerned about exporters and the logistical difficulties that they face, which isn't helping given the difficulties they already face. So I look forward to your report coming out of that. I know you've got a lot of work to do in a relatively short amount of time, so I really am glad that you're on the case. I want to thank everyone. Well, let me just say, while we're still in open session, are there any other comments on from any of my colleagues? Commissioner Corey, good? Okay. All right, well, thank you everyone
Good.
for, yep, good, thank you. Thank you everyone for participating in the open part of our meeting today. I think we're going to take a very brief recess before the closed portion. So let's start again at 25 minutes after the hour.
Mr.
sharp.
Chairman?
Yes.
Just to indicate, the live stream will stop now, and the public attendees are asked to be excused at this time.
Okay, are there any other announcements?
No, sir.
Okay, so we will reconvene in closed session at 25 minutes after the hour.